Coming up, the pandemic is returning with a vengeance due to government inaction, the supply chain is failing, rubbish is piling up on the streets, soldiers are having to drive ambulances and fuel tankers, hospitals are overflowing, and to top it all, now we're discharging raw sewage into our rivers, more than 400,000 times in 2020 alone. Let's just remember that dumping raw sewage into inland waterways was illegal within the EU. But 265 Tory MPs have rejected an amendment passed down from the House of Lords which would have stopped this. Another Brexit benefit then, taking back British sovereignty and with it our rights to pump British faeces into British waterways. Stay tuned. Before we get into it, if you enjoy the channel, please like this video, subscribe and click the bell for notification of new videos twice weekly. International Trade Secretary Penny Mordaunt claims that the Lords Amendment would have allowed unlimited costs to be passed on to consumers and that raw sewage discharge can only be stopped by heavy investment in new infrastructure. So the question is, more than 30 years after Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government privatised the water industry, why hasn't this investment already happened? Up until 1988, the water industry was in public ownership with universal provision and costs based on property value. Ouch, the Tories didn't like that one bit. So over the years, they implemented the right-wing playbook by defunding the sector, getting consumers annoyed and critical of the state-run utility as a precursor for pushing through privatisation. For example, investment in the water sector in 1980 under Margaret Thatcher was at 1/3 the level it had been just a decade earlier under Harold Wilson's Labour government. We saw a similar strategy adopted with underinvestment in British Rail, and currently as well with the NHS under consecutive Tory governments. And based on creeping privatisation, we all know where the NHS is headed unless the nation comes to its senses at the next election. So, following the recommendation of Environment Secretary George Useless Eustace, the amendment was voted down by all but 22 Tory MPs. This seems to set the tone for the government's post-Brexit environmental policy. After years of Tory Brexiteers claiming that the EU was preventing them from raising environmental standards, which, by the way, was never true, the EU only ever set minimum standards, we now see the truth. That the removal of EU standards has seen this Tory government being able to prioritise the profits of their chums and the water companies over the health and safety of the population and environmental standards. It's always about profit with the Tories, and it's a national embarrassment in the lead up to the nation hosting the COP26 environmental conference in Glasgow starting this weekend. The government are basically giving polluters the green light to dump potentially harmful sewage that may contain viable COVID-19 viruses into rivers and into the sea. But why, you may ask? Is it really all about profit? Well, yes and no. There's no doubt that the chronic underinvestment in water can be laid at the doors of the water companies, prioritising the £57 billion in profit dividends that they've paid out to their shareholders in the last 30 years, and they prioritise that definitely over environmental standards. But what has brought everything to a head is Brexit. Since leaving the EU, businesses have found it harder to source water treatment chemicals because of, you guessed it, supply chain disruption at the ports. That is why the Environment Agency have waived the rules and allowed the water companies to discharge effluent without meeting the conditions of their permits, which mandate a multi-step treatment process. The reason they've done this? Well, to use their own words to those companies discharging effluent, you may not be able to comply with your permit if you cannot get the chemicals you use to treat the effluent you discharge because of the UK's new relationship with the EU. Brexit really is the gift that keeps giving, isn't it? Amelia Womack, Deputy Leader of the Green Party, puts this down to failures of government, accusing them of using the environment as a dumping ground instead of addressing the root causes of the problem, which, consistent with the Environment Agency's statement, she sees as broken supply chains caused by Brexit. To continue this theme, Tory MPs last week rejected another House of Lords amendment, this one pertaining to air quality. Peers had amended the legislation to set a limit on particle pollution, which would be at least as strict as World Health Organization guidance, by 2030. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds has said that the government was falling short of its pledge to leave the natural environment in a better state than it had inherited it. And a campaign group, Surfers Against Sewage, who lobbied the House of Lords for the amendment outlawing raw sewage discharge, said it was astonishing that, in this critical decade for the environment, the government is opting out of amendments designed to better protect the planet and all its precious inhabitants. We left the European Union less than 10 months ago, yet already this toxic government are dismantling the environmental protections afforded us by EU membership. We see similar dismantling taking place with employment protection measures mandated by the EU, with the government taking steps to ensure that employers can more easily instigate hire and fire practices, where current employees can be fired and rehired on significantly worse terms with no recourse to an unfair dismissal claim at an employment tribunal. Who, in any case, by the way, have current case backlogs of around 2 years. Another ploy from this government to reduce employment protection rights. The Tories are on the side of employers against employees, they favour corporations over consumers, and as we've covered in this video, they prioritise profits over the environment.